the important thing, and there's several different reasons why somebody would be interested, but for me, it's the ability to communicate across different hosting providers so that you're not locked in to one, because once one hosting provider gets some network effects and kind of something like a monopoly, then kind of the rules start to change in a way that's not necessarily favorable to the participants. So for me, the number one attraction is just simply the ability to communicate across hosting providers.
This time on 20 Minutes into the Future, John Lebkowski and Scoop Sweeney explore IndieWeb with Tom Brown and Manton Reece.
Hey, welcome to the Plutopia podcast. The subject for this episode is IndieWeb. So what is IndieWeb? That's the thing we're going to talk about today. If you look at the IndieWeb website at IndieWeb.org, you'll see a good overview, which starts by saying that when you post something on the web, it should belong to you, not a corporation. The idea that our experience of the internet and of the web is mediated by corporations is troubling to many of us who used the internet before it mainstreamed and became an environment where corporate presences were taken for granted. So today we're going to talk to Tom Brown and Manton Reece, both of whom are deeply involved in IndieWeb and IndieWeb development, and get a sense of what the IndieWeb is all about. And hopefully by the end of this talk, those of you who are listening will be excited enough to find your own way onto the IndieWeb. So we'll start by just asking our guests to introduce themselves. Tom.
Thanks, John. I'm Tom Brown. I interested in all things digital identity, collaboration, security, privacy, and been interested in the IndieWeb for 5 or 6 years. I know it's a little bit longer than that, and glad to be here.
Excellent. And Manton.
Hi, my name is Manton. Good to be here. I am currently, my big project is Micro.blog that I work on, and I've been familiar with the IndieWeb for a while, but really in the last couple of years I've been working on Micro.blog, which is, I think, really IndieWeb friendly, kind of blogging platform and social network. Ever since I started working on that, I've been just much more involved in the IndieWeb and love what all those folks around the country, around the world are thinking about and have been working toward.
So where does the IndieWeb movement come from? Who started the ball rolling on this?
Man, you want to take that?
I was going to say that you might be able to answer it even better than I can, but yeah, it was founded. There was a few folks that met up at, I think it was the Distributed Web Summit in Portland, and we're talking about kind of the rise of social networks and people putting all their content in these kind of closed silos, Twitter, Facebook, where you just don't have the same kind of control over your own writing and photos and anything you want to post online. And they started talking about having an IndieWeb camp, kind of a conference where people can get together and kind of talk about controlling your own content again, having your own website, and the kind of things that people do, kind of creative things on their own site. And I can't remember the year offhand, but yeah, as Tom said, probably a little more than 5-6 years ago, 7 years ago, perhaps. And it's been rolling ever since. And there's a couple of the founders, Tontik and Aaron Parecki, were at that first kind of meetup and are still really active. And then, people have come and gone over the years, but a lot of people are still really active at meetups and at IndieWeb camp conferences. There's a few throughout the year. And so I feel like it's gaining a lot of momentum recently too, as people kind of become more aware of some of the problems of the big social networks, and they want to kind of get back to blogging and having their own website. So it feels like it's really growing a lot lately in the last year or two. Talk
about the reason for the IndieWeb. Why is IndieWeb a thing now, and why did we need to start talking about indie or independent web?
Well, for me, the important thing, and there's several different reasons why somebody would be interested, but for me, it's the ability to communicate across different hosting providers so that you're not locked in to one, because once one hosting provider gets some network effects and kind of something like a monopoly, then kind of the rules start to change in a way that's not necessarily favorable to the participants. So for me, the number one attraction is just simply the ability to communicate across hosting providers.
You know, one of the things that impressed me with the documents I've seen online, John connected me to a few of them, is the ability to maintain and own your own data rather than turning it over to the silos that are Facebook and Twitter and whatever social media you use. And my area of interest has been for a long time internet radio, and I had some bad experiences in the early days when you had to put all of your music onto a service, and if they went away, so did your music. And it seems like IndieWeb wants to give you ownership of your data, and you don't have to rely on someone like Facebook to give it back to you.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mention radio and audio, and like podcasting, which we're on now, is a pretty kind of, it's for some, well, not for some reason, there are specific reasons, but it has been kind of unique in that it is one of the more IndieWeb friendly kind of parts of the web that have lasted and have not so far been taken over by the big silos that you mentioned. Podcasting has still stayed really independent, where you don't have one company controlling distribution. And yeah, I think it's actually a model for how more of the web should work. But it's kind of a nice reminder that there are parts of the web still that remain really personal, owned by actual creators, and not having a few big companies control distribution.
Yeah, I have to agree with you that that is the reason I've been so attracted to internet radio, having started out many years ago in commercial radio. And unfortunately, in the last couple of years, the big streamers have put a lot of pressure on the independents to the point that Apple is beginning to actually weed out independent internet broadcasters from iTunes, actually deleting them and pushing people toward, the pay per listen Apple Music. And that seems to be a trend in a lot of these big streamers, is they'd rather you pay to hear their music rather than listen for free to all the thousands of independents out there.
Yeah, I point to podcasting mostly because I think it provides a lot of hope for the rest of the web, because Apple does have a lot of control over the podcast kind of ecosystem, but I think they haven't quite realized the power they have, and they haven't, we can debate kind of what they've done, whether it's good or bad, but they haven't kind of exercised that control too much yet. So yeah, maybe that's a whole discussion. I don't know if we want to go down, but I was thinking about it when you were talking about radio and audio, and how podcasting essentially is very IndieWeb, in that most people that have a podcast have their own domain name. They can record however they want. They can post to their own site. They can move their podcast if they need to. And that's one of the core principles, I think, of the IndieWeb, is you have your own site and your own domain name. So instead of being on twitter.com or Facebook, where they control the domain name and they control, like if you want to move your content, it's easy to get the content out sometimes, but it's difficult to figure out what to do with all the URLs that no longer work. And so podcasting is a good example of, yes, your own domain name, usually your own content. You can move it between hosting platforms if you need to. And that flexibility is a really core part of the IndieWeb to me. It's like getting back to having your own site, where you can some people like to kind of hack around and experiment and fiddle and do things on their own website that they couldn't do on a bigger platform. And some people still want something as simple as a big platform, but still want that control over the URLs and their content so they can move things around if they change their mind.
Yeah, and it's probably worth mentioning, as well as the tools for podcasting, just WordPress, the role of WordPress in the IndieWeb.
Mm-hmm.
WordPress seems to be a really big part of it because it has continued to be a fairly easily obtainable, accessible, easy to set up, and completely open source tool for adding online content. And I've noticed that much of the development for the IndieWeb is related to WordPress, i.e. WordPress plugins.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, WordPress is so huge, really. It powers so much of the web, and it's just so popular that it makes a lot of sense to me and to others in the IndieWeb community that are actively working on WordPress plugins to just make that the best experience that it can be. Just because it's even WordPress is too much for a lot of people, and so you can kind of get just really derailed and off in the weeds and customizing and dealing with plugins, and a lot of people just don't want to make time for that. But it is pretty accessible in terms of bring up your own website. It is pretty well understood, and so the more that the IndieWeb formats and protocols and just kind of principles can work with such a popular platform, I think that's really good.
And the focus of the technology is sharing, basically, right? Being able to share content without going through some kind of centralized corporate, like Facebook kind of platform.
Yep, right, exactly. And a lot of these platforms have much more open, the kind of the WordPress style platforms in terms of blog software you run yourself, for example, have much more open APIs usually in terms of how you get that content in there, and the different, like a lot of flexibility in the different apps you might want to use. So like I'd mentioned Micro.blog, which is what I've been working on the last couple of years. And, we can host your blog, but we can also work really well with WordPress, right? So you can use our Micro.blog app to post directly to WordPress. And that's possible because of these open APIs. So that's another, I think, a really core part of the IndieWeb is not trying to have proprietary APIs and lock things down so that, one company or even a few companies control how you post to your own website. Like, this stuff should be open so you can have a lot of different tools that work together. So I can have one tool I might want to use Micro.blog to post to my website. You might want to use the WordPress interface or something else, and they can all kind of work together.
Yeah, I readily imported all of my WordPress content from years of blogging into Micro.blog.
Great.
And
excellent.
It was a very smooth experience. So what led you to decide to build Micro.blog?
I think mostly it was kind of coming to the realization that so many people that could be posting to their own website and could be blogging just kind of tweet instead. And if blogging was easier and getting back to having your own website was easier, more people would do it. And so I think this is something that the IndieWeb realized pretty early on too, which is, you can bring some of the ideas kind of from the old web of having your own website, but match that with modern, UI and, the timeline experience that a lot of people like, and just kind of the innovations that we have from social networks, how easy it is to post to Instagram, for example. That it should be that easy to post to your own website too. And so that was a big part of Micro.blog, is trying to make it easier to post to your own site and have your own domain name, because if it's easier, more people will do it. And I think that really it benefits everybody. It benefits the web as a whole, and it also is just better for you as just someone posting to your own site and having that flexibility of controlling your content.
Yeah, and that's one of the main principles of the IndieWeb is user design over protocols. As much as having these common protocols allows things to be easy, moving from WordPress to Micro.blog and back, really the main thing and more important is the user experience, and that's maybe the most important design principle of the IndieWeb.
Tom, do you see IndieWeb as having a relationship to the identity sort of workshop movement that you've been involved with over the years?
Oh, yes, definitely. We're actually going to have one of the co-founders, Aaron Frecke, at next week's Internet Identity Workshop. So I'm really looking forward to some IndieWeb sessions at the Computer History Museum next week. And it's kind of funny because, 12 years ago, I kind of feel the same excitement with the IndieWeb as I did 12 years ago when we had OpenID emerge. And OpenID was I was really enthusiastic about it back then, but it just did authentication, and we soon realized that there needs to be more kind of interoperability besides just authentication, because authentication by itself was kind of a dead end. So now the IndieWeb is all right, well, let's take that lesson and let's build these interoperable APIs into our blogging, into our timeline, in our newsreader, or whatever you want to call it. And now it has, a lot more kind of potential and staying power, I think.
What adoption can we really expect to a pretty great extent? Participating in the IndieWeb now seems to require at least some tech shops. Do you think that the IndieWeb is going to evolve such that people who are really completely non-technical will be able to leverage the tools?
Oh, definitely. I think that I always like to talk about Amber Case's diagram, where she kind of talks about the different levels of adoption. Where the first adopters are technical, and then later you get the bloggers and journalists, and then finally everyone else. And we're definitely not to the everyone else spot, but I think especially with initiatives and like Micro.blog emerging, where it is drop dead simple to start participating in the IndieWeb. I think that's the direction that it's headed and has the most potential.
So Tim Berners-Lee has introduced a project called Solid, which is kind of based on social linked data, Solid, as a set of conventions and tools for decentralized social apps. Are you familiar with that? That sounds like something that aligns pretty well with IndieWeb intentions.
Yes, we, Matt and I, and some others at the last Austin Homebrew Website Club talked a little bit about Solid, and we're not very informed yet, just because it's kind of new. And it's definitely has some of the same goals as IndieWeb, but might not be totally compatible in terms of some of the design decisions, and might be trying to do a little bit too much at once, and sometimes kind of less is more, and starting with simpler building blocks like the IndieWeb uses can be a better path.
Well, speaking of those building blocks, can you describe some of the IndieWeb tools?
Oh, well, I guess one of the latest kind of tools that was kind of shown off at the last IndieWeb Summit in Portland this summer were the readers, where you get to see your timeline. And there were a few, including altogether.io, and then Aaron Frecke's Monocle, which lets you pretty much have kind of a Twitter experience, but where the timeline is pulling from different sources. So it's not from one domain. It's from, pretty much what we used to do with newsreaders back in 2005-ish. And, but with social features that you would find on Twitter. So to me, that's really exciting. I use it every day. And it's really exciting to be able to like something or reply to something and not be trapped in a silo to have those functionalities.
Which one are you using, Monocle?
I use them both. I switch them. I switch back and forth between Monocle and altogether.io.
So this would be similar to a Facebook timeline.
Yes, similar, but with no ads. and like I said, when you like something, it can be content that's on a different site, and that site will get a web mention where the like shows up on that origin site.
One of the interesting things about how all this fits together is, you mentioned a couple of things here with the readers. There's an API called Microsub that you can implement that kind of sits below some of this. But then there's also things like you just mentioned, web mention, which is a way to kind of just tell another website, hey, I linked to you, or I had a comment on your post, or I like something. And there's a couple other things, a couple other APIs and formats that can kind of glue everything together. But one of the nice things about the IndieWeb is it's not like, oh, here are the 5 formats you have to implement to be compatible. It's not strict like that. It's like your site could just implement 1 or 2 of these things and you have something, or you could just have your own domain name and you could just like blog, and that's something too, right? So I like that flexibility where it's not a checklist of here's all the things you have to do. It's, yes, there can be multiple formats and APIs, and a lot of them work together. The more they work together, the better. But it's not so strict that there's only one way to do things.
Have there been any security issues that have sort of emerged within the IndieWeb?
Not that I'm aware of. The one nice thing is that the IndieWeb builds off of existing security protocols like OAuth and that are well tested. The trick is that there's so many different implementations of these of IndieWeb, which of course is a great thing, but of course it's also very hard to secure all the different implementations. But then when there is a vulnerability, it doesn't affect the entire planet. It only affects that small group of users.
What about privacy, though? That's something that's a whole very important thing now. And doesn't the burden of privacy fall back on the individual that's running the IndieWeb site?
Yes, there is a newer spec called private web mention that isn't implemented very. It hasn't really taken hold yet, and it allows you to do like private messages, and if that's what you need. But so far, kind of the development of the IndieWeb is mostly public kind of data. So right now, privacy is not really one of the main design goals, but will be in the future.
I guess the whole idea of sharing online is you're opening up, and privacy wouldn't be as relevant. One of the interesting things about privacy is that to the extent that you want to become social and that you want to connect with other people, you do have to give up some degree of privacy, and your expectation of privacy is reduced, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we can have both, depending on the what we're doing, and it's okay to use a different tool to do private communication that's not necessarily part of your IndieWeb tool set. For instance, like I have a link to a secure messenger available on my personal website. So if somebody wants to send me a secure message, they can click on that link and do it that way. But that's not using any kind of IndieWeb technology.
I think there's also kind of inherent in how things become more distributed, where it minimizes the risk of, for example, when you have like Facebook as a great example, like they're so huge, if they're hacked or there's some data breach and private information is exposed, that affects, millions and millions of people. When you have things a little more distributed, like the IndieWeb, you have smaller social networks that can talk to each other. And in some cases, you just have lots of websites that are just one person. It minimizes the risk a little bit of problems, because you could certainly have widespread software like WordPress as an example we talked about earlier that has some security problem in it, and it affects many, many people. But it tends to, when you have more distributed content, I think it helps relieve some of that pressure of, there's just this one point, of failure where if this is hacked, everything is going to go down. So that's one nice thing. I don't think the IndieWeb is immune to these kind of problems, but I do think it kind of helps when things are a little more distributed. You're also right, though. It's like a lot of this, at least in the early days, we kind of assume that something's on the web and it's public. And Micro.blog, as an example, doesn't have any private posts. Everything's on the web, and that actually simplifies things a lot. And maybe it doesn't appeal to everybody, but it appeals to a lot of people that want to blog and want to publish on the web. And the IndieWeb members, whenever I hear people talk about private posts and privacy in general, I have never heard someone sound like naive about the problems. Everybody's going in knowing the history of the web and potential privacy problems, and let's make sure we get this right, and kind of go slowly with things like private posts and messaging to make sure that that's right.
Do you have any pushback from the big social media silos when you do interact with them? Do they resist? Do they complain? Is there a problem with interacting with them?
I haven't heard of too many problems at a specific level. Like, for example, like one of the big social networks saying, please don't do this anymore, because I think a lot of this is still below the radar for them. But unfortunately, when you have, an API, Facebook API is a good example. Just a few months ago, Facebook really actually just closed down significant parts of their API, and they were trying to combat abuse and bots and, misinformation spreading and things like that. So it's like, it wasn't that they were setting out with bad intentions, but the result of it is that it really cut off a lot of really useful apps and a lot of really useful sharing between indie websites and Facebook. And so, yeah, they didn't really set out to break everything, but anytime you have a company that has that much control, they can make decisions like that, and it really hurts everything else. And so that's one example. Twitter kind of famously also has rules in their guidelines where they say things like, don't build an app that mixes tweets and blog posts or something else together, right? And whether they enforce that completely or not, who knows? Maybe you'll be able to kind of fly under the radar and not get noticed. But they have those specific kind of anti-competitive rules in the language for some of their agreements. And I haven't seen that affect anything on the IndieWeb yet, but there's always that kind of risk on the back of your mind. That some of these big companies, they want to have all the content in their silos, so they're not super thrilled when you build tools that kind of integrate the platforms more.
Yeah, my experience with them is it's not an issue until it impacts either their advertising or the API.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you have a sense of the future of the IndieWeb? Does it feel like there's sort of an evolving and growing adoption, and that the tools are becoming simpler to use and more widely used?
I'll jump in first. I think that the future is definitely ease of use. Tom mentioned this already, but getting the tools and new tools just to be more approachable for people. Because on the IndieWeb, there's certainly a lot of people that like to tinker and build their own things, a lot of coders, a lot of people want to program, and just like, they're not going to use WordPress, right? They're going to build their website from scratch. And that's good. That is a great place for innovation, but we don't want to leave out everybody else. And I think that the IndieWeb recognizes that. And there's actually a recent discussion about kind of improving and redesigning some of the IndieWeb.org kind of landing pages so that it helps guide people. Like, if you're a programmer, yes, go this way, and here's the open source, and here are the tech, the specifications and the things you need to know about. If you want to use WordPress, though, go this way, right? Or if you are using some other platform, go this way, and just kind of to ease people into the best fit for them, because I think everybody wants this to be more widespread. You don't need to be a programmer to be able to build your own website. It should be approachable for anybody who wants to write on the internet, who wants to publish photos. They should be able to have a presence on the web, an identity, their own domain name. They should be able to do this kind of stuff as easily as possible.
Tom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the keynote at IndieWeb Summit was an author named William Hertling, and he'd written a book that had a lot of IndieWeb type of issues in it. And he mentioned that that IndieWeb is going to change the world, and it means like building larger scale services, something that kind of like Micro.blog is doing. But it also needs to have a revenue model to support that. So I think instead of advertising, we're going to start seeing people actually pay a monthly fee to host their presence, which I think is much preferable to advertising. And so I think the main kind of future I see is a social web without advertising, which is very be a very nice thing.
It would indeed. Well, thank you both for joining us today. This has been a great discussion, and we should follow up sometime and check in on how this all evolves.
Yeah, thank you. I really glad to have the opportunity to talk.
Where would someone go if they were new to IndieWeb? Where should they start? Can you give them a starting point?
Manton, you want to?
Sure. So I think IndieWeb.org is a really good place to start to get an overview of everything, and then you can get a little bit lost on that site because there's a lot of pages in there. But just to get that initial overview about what it's about, what the different events maybe in the city near you, and just kind of what people are up to. I'm biased, of course, because of Micro.blog, but I think that's a great place for starting a blog that's IndieWeb friendly, or participating in, again, kind of a smaller scale social network that can talk to other IndieWeb sites. But I would say IndieWeb.org is a good place to start, and then hopefully you can find some links out from there. And
we'll add links to the text that accompanies this podcast. And we will also start adding IndieWeb plugins to our site.
Excellent.
I guess the one last thing I want to say is this word Plutopia for the Plutopia News Network was based on somebody kind of talking about what they referred to as pluralist utopias. We had done an installation about the DIY home of the future, and the idea was that homes were going to be configurable, and people could sort of configure their house any number of ways, and that everybody would sort of have their own little utopia, their own sort of perfect world that they could build. And I think IndieWeb is kind of like that too. It's like it really invites people not to fall into a particular mold that you would have if you were in a site like Facebook or a site like Twitter, where you're sort of constrained by their limitations, but that you can create your online presence any way that makes sense to you in any way that you kind of want to, and that people should be empowered to do that. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about the IndieWeb.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like using that word empowering I think that's a big part of it. It's like empowering ourselves through better software, through these formats and protocols, and just the idea, just the principles of having control over our content. Again, I think that's a huge part of it.
Learn more about IndieWeb at IndieWeb.org. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.